All right, so before we finish up looking at how this brush palette works, because there are a lot of settings, and like I was saying, you can move stuff around and things will change a little bit. For example, if I can grab it, we'll rearrange, but there's so much more than just moving a window around. But before we do that, I do want to talk about what this option bar is doing, because it has to do with how you store stuff and tool preset brushes, all that. So before I could do that, I need to skip ahead just a little bit and talk about what spacing is. Heads up, by the way, if you're on some of the color modes, on some of the versions of Photoshop, you can't always see this very well. That's one of the reasons I like this light color mode. You can tell that I'm on something called brush tip shape. If I click on brush dynamics, I'm on something called brush dynamics. In some versions and at some color layouts, you can't see that brush tip shape is a selectable menu option, but it is, and it's a very, very important one. It has spacing in it. So let's go over to the default brush real quick. Notice how nice this looks, but then when I paint with it, it looks pretty okay. But then if I were to go to brushes and I were to pick like the standard default brush, which I think is the general brush, I think they call it hard round. I'm a little suspicious this isn't the original one. Yeah, it's a little too pretty. Let's see if I can find the original. Oh yeah. All right, so sorry, let me circle around. There's one thing, I always forget this. There's one thing missing by default in the newer versions of Photoshop, and that's the every brush since the dawn of time. So we need to bring those up real quick so I can demo this. Let me drag this over, click the flyout menu, and notice we have something called legacy brushes and converted legacy tool preset. I'll talk about that in a second. I'm just going to open up legacy brushes. Restore legacy brushes set to the list of brush presets. Yeah, absolutely. So legacy brushes has, notice we have general brushes. It has stuff like default brushes, and it has the hard round, which is the original hard round of Photoshop since, wow, a really long time ago, before they had letters in the name. I'm thinking like version 3 had these. I know version 4 certainly did. 5.5 did. I think 4 did. All right, anyway, I'm getting lost in memory. Okay, so real quick, let's just pop open to brush settings. Notice these strange little bumply things, these little mounds that are coming up. Let me zoom in so you can see them very well. Just click on the zoom tool, spacebar to get the hand tool, move over, B to get the brush tool back. See that? What is that? What's going on there? Well, a couple of things. If the astute viewer will notice that I have opacity of 45, so you might think, oh, it's got to be that. Well, unfortunately, no. What's happening is that this brush is actually a sample of very small dabs. So this stroke, I should say, is a sample of dabs. What's a dab? Click once, that's a dab. That's it. In this case, it's a round circle. If I come over to spacing, notice it's set to 25. On computers up until, when? 2015 or so, this was pretty useful, because you could lower the spacing when you needed to and leave it up by default, and it would be easier on the processor. What you really want is a spacing of 1%, and that's so smooth. And if you really get into it, Z on the keyboard for zoom, you can see that it's getting covered by the anti-aliasing. And if you think back to, wow, a few months back in your first Photoshop class, get B, anti-aliasing is essentially just a drop-off. So you can see how I've got these kind of grays. If I had the pencil tool, it should be N, I think, on the keyboard. No, maybe not. Where are you hiding now? Pencil tool, frame tool. I don't want you. I want under brush, pencil tool, derp. If I bring this up, this pencil tools have no anti-aliasing on them. So if I just click, this is what the world is like without anti-aliasing. Let me get the brush tool. Shift B on the keyboard will let me toggle through all those till I get to the brush. Left bracket key to make that smaller. See that soft fuzzy edge? That's just levels of gradient. And if I were to zoom in with the magnifier tool, you can see that it literally is just going from the black somewhere in here to dark, lighter and lighter grays until it gets to something pretty close to white. You can control a lot of those aspects. We'll talk about that later. Pencil tool doesn't have any of that, and in some cases that's really, really useful. But for us, we're going to stick with it. So I got on a tangent there. Sorry. What that really boils down to is that 1%, it's those they're pressed so close together, the anti-alias is actually hiding those samples. And what are those samples? Be on the keyboard, get the brush. Well, it means this. Let's crank the spacing instead of 1%. We'll move it up. There are all those dabs. And in fact, at 100%, they will not quite touch. I can go over it, of course, but they're not going to touch. So I have this little string of dots. And this isn't a legacy thing. Even if we come over to the new general brushes and we pop open a standard hard round, we'll still have this spacing. They just set it to 5% instead of 25%. So if I crank that thing up to like way too high, you get these little speckles. All right, now this is important later, and out of fear that you might have missed something, like if you're getting some coffee while I'm talking, I'll talk about this again later. But I'm just going to set this brush for the moment to be little blobs that don't overlap by default. And now let me show you why. So I can demonstrate this. Z on the keyboard for zoom, Alt key, click a couple times to get this back to a good size. Cool. B on the keyboard, get the brush. And I'm going to make a new layer here so that we can demonstrate. Right bracket key a couple times to increase the size. All right, what's the difference between opacity and flow? Let's use a color so it's nice and pretty. Doesn't really matter, black will work fine, but just to demonstrate. Here I am at 100% opacity, 100% flow on this kind of chain of stamps that I built. Click and drag. And it's doing exactly what the preview says it will do. It's simply creating a bunch of blobs. If I were to lower the opacity down to, say, 45%, and be warned, some versions of Photoshop, I want to say 6 before the 6.1 update on CS6, there are a number of others, sometimes opacity won't work right, so you'll want to test that. So I'm at 45%. Let me show you what I mean. Look, it's 45% of the opacity. I mean, literally, if we were to create a, if we were to create a color layer, a solid color layer below it using the black white adjustment layer icon and make a kind of dull orange, pop that under it, you can see 100% the green's not affected. Orange was a bad choice. It looks like a different color because guess what? Our eyes are remixing it a bit. Let's just double click that. We'll make it blue. That shouldn't interfere too much. There we go. So we've got our green at 100% opacity and green at 45% opacity. We'll talk about this more when we cover blending modes and layers and all that stuff. But what that really means is intuitively, you have 45% of the visuals of whatever you painted, and then it's 55% transparent. So a little over half the blue's getting mixed in on it. All right, so let me go back to the brush. Let me paint again. Give you an idea. If I release the mouse and click again, I can start bringing this up. So 3 clicks, 1, 2, 3, should bring us to 100% opacity. It doesn't look like it did. Let me get the eyedropper tool. Clicky, clicky. Sample. Let me pop this open. Sample. Okay. Look at that. Okay, so it looks like this is going to be one of those versions of Photoshop where addition isn't necessarily the way we expect. That's fine. There's some tools and things we can do in here to fix that. In fact, it may be a pressure sensing inside of the brush that I picked since I didn't use a legacy brush. Let's do one quick check. If I were to pop over to the legacy brush, hard around, go to the brush settings, put the spacing up to 100% again. 100%. Oh, 1, 2. Nope. Oh, look at that. Looks like it takes about 5 clicks. So there's some kind of rounding going off. It might be the smoothing settings or some other stuff. We'll investigate that as we go. But as you can see, every time I clicked, and we're only on one layer here, every time I clicked, it increased the color essentially of what was in. The opacity increased. I don't want to say color because the transparency decreased. There we are. The opacity increased, the transparency decreased. And so as I just paint, nothing's happening. But if I let go and paint over another time, you'd see each one of those long strokes behaves as a single stroke. It's assembling it for you. When you let go and click again, now you got a new one. So why did I spend so much time going over opacity? In fact, you might have already known that. Let me crank this back up to 100%. Now we got 100%, right? Well, let's look at flow. If you take flow down to 45% and you paint, in this case, it looks the same, right? And you can let go and you can paint again And you can let go, you can paint again, fine. So doesn't really do that much. Well, not really. So while every time I wanted to increase the opacity, I had to let go of the mouse when it was just the opacity decreased, and then paint again, another stroke, another stroke. Watch what happens if I start going over it with just the flow. So at first it behaves exactly as you'd expect. Let me back up. I'm not releasing the mouse. Oh, look at this. It's not assembling it in one go. Every time I paint over it, it is adding it as though each one of these little samples, these little dabs here, is a whole new stroke altogether, as though I've released the mouse and painted it again. And that lets me do a gentle build-up for things, which can be kind of fun, especially if you're doing digital painting. So there's a difference. If you're doing digital illustration, frequently you won't want this because you don't have total control over it. But if you're painting digitally, you may want this just to have some random factors rolled in and to have some beautiful gradations pop up. And I think this is actually kind of pretty. So the question is, why did I mess around with spacing? Why did I have to show you all that? Why didn't I just turn it on? Here's why. If I pop back over to brushes and I roll on back up to our general brush and get our hard round, let me put all of this back. This is all the default standard stroke, right? And in fact, the brush setting as the spacing of 5%. Great. But we know now that this spacing means those dabs are being tapped out. And that doesn't matter with opacity because it's calculating the opacity when you release, right? That's it. What happens if we lower it down to 45? Nothing, right? Because it will just, well, nothing unexpected. It'll just lower the opacity 45% and we can stroke it out. Done. But if we have opacity at 100% and flow at 45%, knowing what we now know, we'll probably see a bunch of little dabs just overlapping each other. Let me make a stroke. Oh, that's a little weird. See this blur, this fuzz? What's going on there? Well, let's increase the spacing so that we get those dabs. I'm going to accentuate it quite a bit, 39. And aha. So that's why I lowered it when I did. I really wanted to demonstrate what was going on without confusing. And so if you just have the flow with a low spacing, like hit B on the keyboard real quick, like 5% or even 1%, it's just going to not look that different. It's just smearier edges, which is nice, but it also doesn't really explain everything that's going on. Flow is a way to have the opacity overlap on a single stroke, so you can keep coming back again and again. On some brushes, and this is actually what's called a capture brush, that may have effects that you're not expecting. On other brushes, like an erodible tip brush, and we'll talk about what those are, it will behave differently as well. And not because, the end result will look different. The behavior is always the same, but the end result may be different depending on the kind of brush that you have. So that's what opacity and flow is. And now that we've talked about that, we can go over what's being stored. And by that I mean what's being stored with the standard brushes, what's being stored with the tool presets, where everything is. So I will catch you on the next video when we finish investigating what exactly we're capturing with this brush. See you in a second.